Okay. So what we want to do today is certainly get through perception, and then, God help us, try to do something to force an understanding. Surprised to see any of you here. It is, I know I had a moment where I just wept this afternoon as I tried to make my way through it again. It is, by the way, the most difficult 21 pages or whatever in all the tables. No doubt about it. I think there's a harder than that. That helps. So, a quick summary then of sense certainty. And what I want to underline is Hegel's argument worked at a series of levels. The argument about sense certainty concerns metaphysical arguments, epistemological arguments, and phenomenological arguments. At the metaphysical level, the argument for sense certainty repeats the metaphysical exposition of space and time in Kant. That is, it does exactly this discovery that the notion of the now generates a series of different nows, and that the cycle of nows will give us a conception of a temporal totality. And as we saw last week, the notion of now is infused, right, with past and future. That the now is the not yet, and the not has been. Secondly, at the notion of here is only possible when there are different heres, and we discovered that this actually has to do with a spatial structure dependent on the human body. That is, there's no here without a there, without a left and a right, above and below, a front and a back, etc. And that there's a primitive spatial schema built in to the upright person. And that gives you your metaphysical, these conceptions of space and time, or a minimal metaphysical conception of space and time. At the epistemological or semantic level, we discover that the concepts now and here do not by themselves pick out a determinate object. That epistemologically, you can only use these concepts as universals, and once they're used as universals, they are mediated. As mediated, they have an inbuilt negativity and complexity. Now, I say all this because there are lots and lots of different ways in which you could get the metaphysical and the epistemological arguments concerning here, now, space and time. That those arguments are not unique to Hegel. Indeed, they're much Kant's arguments. So what's unique to Hegel is not the argument itself, but the means of argument. That is, it's the phenomenological level that is central. And what makes it central is the experience of this form of consciousness. That's what you won't find in other writers, whether it's Sellers or Kant or any other people who make these kind of standard arguments, what are now standard arguments, or in standing with Hegel. So the experience is first, I think it has 4 elements. First, it's the experience of the loss of certainty. So the first thing that sense certainty discovers is its certainty of the this gets lost. And the rest of the whole chapter is it trying to do something with that initial loss. So we begin with that loss. So it discovers that fixity is impossible. So it discovers that there is a movement from night to day. And that movement, of course, from night to day is, as it were, emblematic for Hegel. Second, what is experience? Paragraphs 96-7. If we attempt to hold the now steady, to keep it fixed, is not this day or this night, but the whole. So that sense certainty keeps wanting to say this, and it ends up saying the exact opposite of it. So the experience, and again, this is the experience, is the experience of meaning to say something determinate, but only being able to say the universal. Now. So what means, as we saw last week, to be the most concrete, most specific, most determinate, richest experience turns out to be the emptiest, the most indeterminate, the most, in that sense, untrue. Thirdly, in moving to the level of I mean, where the meaning and something being mine, meaning, meinen, mine, so the German meaning and mine are connected. So what I mean or intend, we experience the attempt to fix our object and the loss of self. I can't say what I mean, and if I can't say what I mean, then there's no mind of this experience. And if there's no mind of this experience, then there's no me to have it. So the very act of intending generates not only a loss of certainty, a loss of concreteness, but a loss of self. So we might say, one of the ones Hegel doesn't answer in this chapter is, who am I? Who is the I that speaks? And this is going to point all the way forward to desire. Finally, Hegel tells us, level 4, that sense certainty is nothing else but this history of losses. That sense certainty has no content because it means to have everything, and because it has nothing, it has no content, so the only content it can have is the history it goes through in discovering its emptiness. about uncertainty that got hung over from last week. Feels kind of urgent now. Yes?
I wanted to ask this question about because 113, it might already be a perception that way.
I'm going to go to 113 right now. 113 is the transition. Anything prior to that? Okay, so there's a hand?
Yeah. Sorry. This you bring this back up again now, but I just have one question about the constituted present you described last time, and related to Husserl and Heidegger's constituted presence.
Yep.
But the phrase that you drew from the encyclopedia was, the second half of the phrase was that the present is pregnant with the future. And that sounds to me a lot like a citation of Leibniz, in which case, in the new essays on human understanding, it's exactly the phrase that he uses to explain the sort of relationship among perceptions to apperception. And I just wanted to, I didn't know if that was something that you thought about, because it seems as though it would yield potentially a very different understanding of what that constituted present is all about. The status of death would be very different, and it wouldn't necessarily, so I don't know if that...
The reason why I think that the Hegelian is going back to Kant's account of the reproductive imagination, the threefold synthesis, and that therefore, to Husserlian protension, retension, or static temporality in Heidegger, why it's that structure, is precisely because Leibniz really does have a notion of presence. So it is true that any present is pregnant with the future, but that's because of the algorithm underlying it, right? It's all there. So every moment is pregnant. If you want to see another notion of the pregnant moment, the best account is Lessing's Lao Kun, right? I'm not going to, that's another course. Just lectured on it yesterday, so it's fresh in my mind, but that's the whole question of how something spatial can represent something temporal. Right? That's another issue and that's a question of representation, not of time itself. So the phrase, but all was just to say, I was using a phrase that hangs around, that the notion of pregnant, a present pregnant with the future, can be said from almost any metaphysical standpoint, but for different reasons. This is why I keep wanting to understand Hegel's precise reasons, right? Why I wanted the phenomenological level and not merely the metaphysical and epistemological level. Okay. Let's move then to paragraph 113, which is a nice transition. So it is clear that what sense certainty lacks, one of the necessary conditions, what it needs in order to say this, what it refused to acknowledge, was the existence of universals. So, next form of consciousness is going to be a form of consciousness which, we want to keep it minimal, so we want consciousness to remain passive and perceptual. I just want to look at the world, but now instead of seeing this, I'm going to see objects as composed of universals. So, and that this process of seeing this is then going to be described. The reason I wanted to go to 113 is it reminds us of the notion of determinate negation, and whatever the hell Hegel means by sublation or Aufhebung, all of that's right here, so we get the whole kind of structure of those concepts to remind us of the introduction. Now this is therefore established as not this. or as something superseded, aufgehoben, and hence not as nothing, but as a determinate nothing, the nothing of a content, namely of the this. Consequently, the sense element. So I can't say this. I'm forced to another way of holding it. I have to I have to acknowledge now the new form of consciousness, to acknowledge what the previous form of consciousness would not acknowledge. That's why it's a determinate negation. It negates the emptiness of the previous standpoint, but it still wants to hold on to immediate awareness. But the immediate awareness now is going to be of something else, not the this, but of the this with universals. So consequently, the sense element is still present. That's why we call this perception. But not in the way it was supposed to be, in the position of immediate certainty. Not as a singular item as it's meant, but as a universal, or as that which will be defined as property. And I'll explain to you why property in a moment. But the new standpoint has to preserve the intention of the previous standpoint and ask the question, how might that intention, opening my eyes and looking, be an awareness of a determinate object? And it's going to be in virtue of having before it a thing with properties. So supersession, or overcoming, exhibits its true twofold meaning, which we have seen in the negative. It is at once a negating, we negate the particularity, and a preserving. We preserve the sense element in order to carry on. Our nothing, as the nothing of the this, preserves its immediacy and is itself sensuous. So perception is going to be immediate and sensuous, but it is universal immediacy. Being, however, is a universal in virtue of its having mediation or the negative within it. When it expresses this in its immediacy, it is a differentiated, determinate property. As a result, many such properties are established simultaneously, one being the negative of the other. So perception is, and I now simply offer this as an onus probandi, right? This next simplest form of consciousness, which preserves the original intention of sense certainty, but does what's necessary in order to accomplish its original intention, namely immediate sense awareness. So the new form of consciousness is going to be called perception. That's the form of knowing. And its object are going to be things with properties. So the issue, and by the way, this is, if force and understanding is a killer, this is really almost the easiest moment in the whole text. Which, if it didn't feel that way, it will in another 15 minutes. It really isn't. The issue is how a passive perceiver could be said to experience plural qualities as properties of a thing, where things are one and properties are many. So I'm taking it. Hegel's taking it. I think everybody in the universe takes it. that this is our simple, ordinary conception of a thing. A thing, and we're talking now not about deep substance or about, we're talking about what in England they call medium-sized dry goods. This is Oxford. I don't know why. Medium-sized watches and chairs and tables and things that you can pick up or look at or have a human dimension to them, that kind of size. And we've taken that things are a one that is different from other things, and what makes a thing one, everyone seems to agree, is properties it's composed of. That's the simple phenomenological description of the model we're using, without any fancy metaphysics. And we're thinking that it is in virtue of this combination of a one with many properties that things have their determinacy. This watch, that table, the bottle. And we're considering these things simply as perceptual givens. Almost kind of comprehensible. Okay. So we just see the world, and I think we do, as composed of these medium-sized dry goods, each of which is one thing, each different from others, and each manifesting a range of properties. So far, so good. All right, let's get a little more precise. For such a consciousness, the determinacy of the this is given through, and I should say, interrupting myself, a thing with properties. One, many. So whatever this chapter is about, and the next chapter, by the way, it's about the metaphysical structure of the universe, one and many. Just at a very low level. But the problem of one and the many is the puzzle that's going to drive right through these next two chapters. How are the one and the many connected? How do they relate to one another? Why do we need both those notions in order to think about things? What is a thing? That it has this structure, namely the idea of being a one with many properties. So, for such a consciousness, the determinacy of this is given through a manifold or complexity of elements, and that these elements must, we now believe, be universals. Why? Well, let's say I've got something that is, holding in my hand, red and round and firm, and if I bit into it, juicy, sweet. None of those predicates would have content if each were a logically proper name. That is, they cannot be names of unique particulars. Rather, they must be names which would make each perceptual episode radically individual and therefore radically different from every other perceptual episode. So what makes the episode comprehensible is those predicates are repeatable properties that we see over and over again manifested in different ways. We see round and red, just in all different settings. And something about this object is how it collects up those otherwise universal properties. So the specificity of the this, right, is being gotten through its way of holding together these otherwise universal properties. So indeed, we need universals here. Otherwise, we're just back in sense certainty. Okay. Further, these qualities cannot be independent existences. Because if they were independent existences, then they wouldn't have anything to do with the thing. I just have various experiences of redness or juiciness or roundness, but not experience of an object. So in order for these universals to play the kind of role, mainly making something determinate, they must be what we call properties. That is, they are properties of something. That is, in here or at here or connect to some object. So they're not things in themselves. They're not self-sufficient. There are views of universals that are like that. There was a guy named Dr. Plato. He had a thought like that, right? But that won't do for objects. We need properties, and therefore items that are instanced in things, in here, and the like. And this entails that a mere succession of properties does not itself discriminate a thing. Since a mere succession of properties, some sort of mad Humean fantasy, if they're truly mutually indifferent to one another, will not give us anything whatsoever. So we need the idea that somehow the notion of a thing collects up the many. So what we need to think about the question of what's the difference between a mere concatenation of property, however proximate. Right now, this bottle is perfectly contiguous with my fingers. So it's got all the notions of continuity, succession, contiguity, causal inherence. Why is the bottle not me? What is it? And I think this is a deep question. One that empiricists were hopeless with. What is it that makes something a thing rather than a mere succession of properties? And I'm taking mere succession like this, that C.B. Broad, one of my favorite philosophers, he really bought the empiricist line, and he had what I call a regularity theory of objects. And he said, if I regularly see, and he's, by the way, just following logic here, if I regularly see round and red and juicy and firm and blah, 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 and that these things always repeat, as it were, together, then that's what makes a thing. So it's simply the regularity of their hanging together. But that looks pretty contingent. I take it that probably no one in this room has ever seen me without my glasses. So it has all the features of contiguity and connectedness and regularity, and yet I take it we want to say, however much we think about prostheses and the like, that nonetheless they are not the same as me. So there's a real metaphysical puzzle here. And this chapter is about how to handle that metaphysical puzzle from the standpoint of perceptual passivity. That is, what possibilities are open to someone who believes in immediacy of perceptual awareness, a Locke or a Hume or a Reid, in order to provide such an account. Puzzle? Hegel thinks there are just two possible strategies open to perception. Not overall, but to perception. Namely, strategies that would allow it to remain passive, remain apprehending without comprehending. And they are this. Either unity follows from succession, which he calls also, auch, or what I call, just so you have a nice metaphysical name for it, the concatenation model. Let's give it a name. What the hell? Let's invent some names. Concatenation model of the thing, and this is more or less the C.D. Broad model, or unity precedes succession, which he calls the one, and in the metaphysical literature, this already has a name, is called the bare substratum model. Bare substratum model. And it was actually very hot in the late 50s and early 60s because of a metaphysician in Iowa named Gustav Bergmann. Iowa's like that. Full of German metaphysicians. Okay. Now, what makes this chapter simple is that these possibilities generate a straightforward paradox. And the paradox works like this. The problem with succession, that is, unity following the also model, concatenation model, is there is no determinate way in which we can stop knowing when to, as it were, make the cutoff point. Right? So again, if we again had just the experience of everything that happens in this room, you would have to say from the succession model that glasses, these things, which are movable, so is my finger, are part of it. That is, they fulfill all the criteria of continuity and the like. So there's no place to stop. In other words, we can't really get going unless we presuppose a one. Unless we say, no. We already have some idea of the independence of the object. It's a one, and that will give us what we need. But that's also false. And the reason it's false is, well, why is the beta substratum false? Anyway.
It's a moment of negation.
Well, that's all right. I mean, we can play with negation as perception does, because we can put it, yeah?
For the same reason as the other one is false, right? Because there's no determinate reason why to choose that particular thing, right?
Absolutely. So where's the determinacy going to come from? From the also. Exactly. You're thrown back to the other moment. You're thrown back to the many properties. The problem with the bare substratum is even if you think there's a kind of, I hate the pun, a core of appleness, it just happened. It wouldn't have been. You were great. Even if you suppose there's a substratum of appleness holding together all these things, how would you know it apart from the red, round, blah, blah, blah? So the determinist of the bare substratum may do a job of collecting, right? But you lose the determinacy. So it begs the question. So what's going to happen here throughout this chapter is that we're going to see, and I'm going to do it pretty quickly because, again, now that you see the puzzle, you can see that what perception's going to do is to distribute the moments. So it's going to distribute the moments by sometimes saying the object is really essentially the one, but only appears to me as many. Right? So it puts the oneness in the object and the manyness in me. Or it will do the opposite and say, no, the object is really the many, but I am the source of the unification, the oneing of it, and all the problems that I already mentioned, right, will come back. But what's happening here, notice, by distributing the moments out, is that what perception is forced to do, which I mentioned last time, is to take responsibility for error or falsity. That is, it acknowledges that there's a problem here, and its strategy is to say the error is always in me. The object is what it is independently of me. This is, after all, still consciousness. And I simply wrongly take it in one way rather than another. So perception is always trying to keep the object as an in itself while keeping its so the truth is still the in itself, and while subjectivity then becomes a source of error. So an object can appear to perception as many. You can think of this as a crude anticipation of the distinction between primary and secondary qualities. Will come up actually in the next section. In which case the object becomes indeterminate. It becomes indeterminate because there's nothing that makes it, and that shows that this is perfect Hegelian argument. Secondary properties cannot be secondary. They can't be secondary because there would nothing, whatever is supposed to be the one would have no determinacy without them. The redness, the juiciness. Okay, well, let's look at the text a little bit. And I do want to do this quickly, just to see how this works out. So all that's going to happen is a working out of this paradigm. And we'll see that force and understanding it's almost there. I mean, you have to really work hard for it not to emerge in the discussion of perception. So, start with paragraph 117. And the reason to start with paragraph 117 is everything up until then is philosophical overview, and it's paragraph 117 is where the phenomenological analysis itself begins. Remember, we have to segregate philosophical exposition, what we understand, from actual phenomenological working through. So the phenomenological working through happens at 117, and I never counted it. Maybe someone will do it while we're going through paragraph 117. But I think 117 contains something like 6 or 7 different movements by perception in order to make itself good. I mean, it really goes very quickly. Okay, so it just pushes perception to try to say what it wants to say, and it's forced to say a variety of different things. So, let us see what consciousness experiences in its actual perceiving. For us, the experience, blah, blah, blah. Okay, the object, starting phenomenologically, the object which I apprehend presents itself purely as a one. Let's just begin with whatever I perceive it as one. But I also perceive in it a property which is universal and which thereby transcends the singularity of the object. The first being of the objective essence as a one was therefore not its true being, but since the object is what is true, the untruth falls in me. I was mistaken to see it just as one all by itself. I actually need the universal. My apprehension was incorrect. On to the next model. Right? I'm telling you, sentence by sentence, it's going to shift models. On account of the universality of the property, I must rather take the objective essence to be the whole community. I now further perceive the property to be determinate, opposed to another, and excluding it. Thus, I did not, in fact, apprehend the objective essence correctly when I defined it as a community with others. So we've already gone from object to universal to community. Now we're up to the fourth version already. I was wrong to call community with others or as a continuity on account of the determinateness of the property. I must break up the continuity and posit the objective essence as a one that excludes. So the puzzle he had, the phenomenological observer has, is he wants to get that determinacy. Universals on their own won't do it. A community won't do it because we've got to, as it were, let the individual properties do their work as individual properties, and hence I have to break up the continuity of the object and realize that the very nature of a property is to exclude other properties. So we have, next model, the broken up one, the sundered one. I find many such properties which do not affect one another, but are mutually indifferent. Therefore, I did not perceive the object correctly when I apprehended as exclusive. On the contrary, just as previously it was only continuity in general, so now it is a universal common medium. That is, I need the particularity, but I need the particularity to be held together. So now I'm going to say that there's a common medium holding these things together in which many properties are present as sensuous universalities, each existing on its own and as determinate, excluding the others. Okay, I can go on and on. The thought here is that perception is being forced to continually revise its metaphysical model to account for the two aspects of the thing. So what's causing the problem, and I want to be just clear about this, what's causing the problem is it needs both. It needs some notion of oneness, and it needs determinateness that is to be given through the manifold of properties. And what he does is that the move I didn't read, the next step, is he gets to the notion of universals as properties. So phenomenologically, perception discovers that properties are what is wanted. But that, of course, we know won't answer the problem. That just now generates a fuller model in which we can explore it. Then, in paragraph 119, perception does, as I suggested it would, it starts divvying up the one and the many between inside and outside. So, the one is out there and the many in me via my sensory modes. Right? So, it's because I have touch, taste, eyes, ears, and the like, that it appears to me as firm, juicy, red, that might. So all those things are in me as its way of appearing. And therefore we become the medium where they gather. But that makes the many inessential again, hence fails to explain how this one excludes other ones. And you return to the thought that secondary properties cannot be truly secondary. Well, you could try, as he does in paragraph 123, thinking of the object as something that gets its determinacy by excluding other objects. So negativity via the exclusion of others. So the bottle is not a table, is not the floor. Well, the problem with that thought, which is, the reason for that thought is to try to evade the notion of the bare substratum, right? You just think of it as these properties are by their nature would exclude those properties. That's the strategy here. And the reason why that will not work is an object cannot exclude another object if it does not possess a moment of self-subsistence. So the logic of exclusion is fine. It's a relation to itself by excluding others. But the question is why? And the answer is, oh, because it's one. And now we're back to the mystery of the one again. Well, what's the problem? Why is perception in this difficulty? What do we need in order to somehow deal with this one many problem. Minimum necessary need.
Comprehension.
How's that going to help? What are we going to comprehend? Yeah, that's what he said. You're right, of course. It's understanding the next step. What does understanding do? What kind of work does understanding do? What kind of new way of thinking about it?
Contemplation, self-reflection, as opposed to mere apprehension and perception.
Not yet. Not yet. And it won't help because, again, I want to stay with the thought of the one and the many. We want to solve this problem, right? And something about our way of thinking about the one and the many is a bit too simplistic. Yeah, Matt?
Well, I mean, this is kind of how Descartes solves the problem, right? So you've got the ball of wax, for instance, and it's like, well, my senses tell me it's like this, it's like that. It can't, this object as an object can't come from my senses because all of these properties, all of God's properties, and then they're different properties, and so where does it come from? So he says, well, it has to be understanding. It has to be kind of rational intuition. This is, I mean, for him it's, I don't know, God being in the world in my head.
That doesn't sound like an answer. That sounds like magic.
and it sounds like magic, but the thing is, if it can't come from out here, and I mean, this is that.
You mean the world doesn't have a structure? No, I mean that seriously. There's a metaphysical problem here. I better not do that. I break things, but the point is they're really things. I mean, and God beaming an equation into my mind is not going to stop making it a thing. There's a metaphysical wet issue here, right? A one and a many. How are you going to unite? Yes, how are we going to unite them? Great, good.
He says force.
Why force? He does say force. Why? What is it about? What's the nature of force that will unite these things? When we say someone is a force of nature, what do we mean by that? Try to get an intuitive feel for why he uses the word force. And he has technical reasons, but think about it. We say, oof, that's a force of nature. What do we mean when we say someone's like that? A capacity. Good. To do what? Well, yeah. No. Capacity is great. There was a hand back there. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, saying, some kind of concept of essence. So you're going to say, this is what's essential to make this thing distinct from something else.
Essence is just talk. How do essences connect? I want an answer.
Well, if you do a force of nature as being a unity that expresses itself in a multiplicity of truths, I guess, so that the motion between the two becomes what the truth is.
The very nature, what is a force? A force is a sort of thing whose very nature is to express itself this way and that way, So when everyone said my mother was a force of nature, they meant, she would insult this one and destroy that one, and, clean up the house, and it seemed like, but the nature. So the answer is the very nature of a force, a one, is to express itself in a diversity of ways. So the problem with the one many in the original thing is they were both inert. And we want to move to a model, a real two-tier model of the object, in which the nature of the in itself, the very nature of the in itself, is to be for another. Right? That's what a force is. The nature of a force is to be forceful, to do something. Yeah.
What's the German that force is translated?
Kraft. Yeah. Power. And of course, he's going to be thinking about different notions of force. He's going to be thinking about gravity. He's going to be thinking about forces of attraction and repulsion. He's going to be thinking about entelechy. He's going to be thinking about energeia. I mean, force is a very basic metaphysical concept. And what makes the notion of force attractive, right, is it has this way of having this duality in itself. So the next step is to move to a real two-tiered model in which appearances are appearances of a non-sensible but real essence. Essence is the word he uses. But an essence that is now going to be, or what he calls, another word he calls it is the unconditioned universal. And the nature of this thing is going to be because, like Locke actually thinks of his two-tier model, primary and secondary properties. What are primary properties? They are those things that have the power to cause. Secondary properties. So it's the structure of the object causes me to see it as red and taste it as juicy and the like. So we have an appearance and reality structure. Why? And this unconditional universal does not appear. So we're still keeping the bare substratum in one sense, but now we've just given it some more metaphysical puff, right? We've given it the power to express itself in terms of these many. And this it is supposed to do. That's just the way. The thought here is, this is just the way things are. So the thought of this two-tier model, is not, as I'll explain in a moment, to be the result of any complex act of theory construction. On the contrary, this is supposed to be just a kind of awareness of the way the world works. So, you can think of Newton here. Newton said, a phrase that was completely false, hypotheses non fingo. I make no hypotheses. He made tons of hypotheses, but his point was he didn't think he was constructing anything. He thought he had made a simple act of discovery. Okay? He thought that the discovery of the universal law of gravitation, which was finite, terrestrial and celestial mechanics, was not any great work, just discovery. Kind of just, oh yeah, there it is. Why call it understanding? Why use the word understanding? As opposed to perception. Why? What? Have another go. You're going to get this right.
I hope so. Force is nothing we actually perceive.
Right.
So we can't really talk about perceiving a force, so we have to talk about understanding.
Okay, now what? So what's the act? I mean, that's absolutely right. It's not an immediate perception. So we think we're understanding the thing in this life. But what's that extra bit? Yeah, Adam?
Well, is it because it's Kant's category for what unites variety of differences according to the pattern rule?
That is what it will be, yes. So that's immensely sophisticated and clever, but not stupid enough. Right? I want something at a gut level. Yeah.
It's because of the way he uses the word explanation. Explanation is what understanding does. It's just the discovery.
Okay. Well, we understand something because we have a question about why. And when we can answer why, we say, oh, now I understand it. So everything in this chapter is going to be a movement of discovering why things are so-and-so. Or saying that things are so-and-so in the light of, or because of. So we are now at a way of thinking about the world where we're not just perceiving it, but, and this is what Roxy was dying to say all hour, right? But comprehending it in some way, although this is a very modest comprehension, in the sense that the very nature of the structure of force and understanding means we are thinking about answering questions, not merely experiencing. So we are saying something is because it is because. So there is always a question of why, of which the force or the universal or the law or whatever we're going to count as essence is going to be the answer. So we do have, let's say, to use Collingwood's way of saying, we are at the level of thinking of at least question and answer. Right? Even though the level of question and answer is not yet theoretical construction, because we think that what we're doing is simply iterating why things are as they are. They are as they are because forces express themselves in a certain way. Okay. Let's take a deep breath, because it really gets worse from here on. But the reason to stop there is because I don't want you to lose the original question from perception, the one of the many. Think that everything that's going to happen in understanding is going to be a further answering of that very question. So we've just got a more sophisticated model, and we have to ask ourselves whether that sophisticated model will do what we originally wanted to do, namely, say, oh, yeah, now I know how I'm related to the world. I'm related to the world by seeing it as appearances of essences. That's a sophisticated way of seeing the world, one informed by natural science, but still it's just a way of seeing the world and saying that's how things are. It's understanding, perceiving of the world. And now we have to see why couldn't things be just like that? Why does Hegel make us suffer so bad? Okay, good. Okay. I'm going to try to do this as simply as I can. Let me say where we're going very quickly so that it's not a mystery. On my reading, what Hegel has to do here is provide a phenomenological recapitulation of the Copernican concern. That is, he has to achieve that idea through the internal working out of how understanding proceeds to try to make sense of things, to show that instead of the world being structured like that, we have to come to discover that we demand that the world be structured like that, and that therefore we cannot separate at the end of the day how the world is from how we must think about the world. And hence we overcome subject-object dualism in doing that, and discover that we can only understand what really is, not by looking at the world, but by thinking about the structure of self-consciousness. That's where we're going. It's that easy. Unfortunately, getting there is not so easy.
Is that different from Kant?
It's what do I want to say now?
I mean, if you substitute self-consciousness for reason, but otherwise, isn't it Kant?
It is certainly Kant, and what's going to be different is that when we get to thinking about self-consciousness, it will turn out that we cannot think about self-consciousness in the way that Kant does. Now we have to, as I was saying last week, think about self-consciousness as a form of human activity rather than as a form of reflection. So this path is to bring us to an acknowledgement of the role of ourselves. So remember what everything in consciousness does is consciousness is that form of relating to the world that thinks the truth is its perception, understanding, grasp of the world. The world is essence, and I simply get it. And hence, the nature of consciousness here, consciousness wants to repudiate the role of its own activity in the constitution of experience. So what we see in sense certainty, what we see in perception, and what we're going to see even more violently here is understanding, trying to make the world have this structure without acknowledging that a structuration like this is unintelligible apart from the needs or demands of understanding itself, and hence, just to cut a long story short, perfect notion, that explanation is not a factual relation of two independent matters. Explanation is something human beings do, and only certain ways of doing it provide satisfaction. And once we acknowledge that what's at stake here is ultimately not the two-tier model itself, but finding an adequate form of explaining the world, and then understanding that explaining the world is a way of thinking about the world, then how the world appears turns out not to be independent from how we think about the world. Okay? That's what's going to happen. So, what we have needed, what perception couldn't manage, is it could not resolve the contradiction between something that was self-related, a one, to something that was other-related, multiple properties. Force, the very nature of the notion of force, is a concept of the identity of being for self by or through being for another. The force of nature. So the very nature of something that is a force of nature is it is what it is, this force of nature, through doing these various things. Throwing parties, making dinner, etc. Probably said too much about my relationship with my mother. So a force is only itself insofar as it forces, that is, utters or expresses itself. It can realize its identity, its self-identity, only by entering into relation with others. Force, further, is not immediately a perceptible reality. A force is only recognizable by going beyond the immediate and recognizing it as the inner of some multiple expression. Therefore, to recognize a force is to now understand that a single identity is manifesting itself through some total panoply of instances. Hence, the thinghood of the thing is itself an inner of some sensible multiplicity. It's a property. And that should tell us, just to show that we've got a transition here, that understanding was implicitly at work even in perception. Because even in perception, I'm claiming, we always were recognizing that the many properties were expressions of the one, and that's what made them the properties they were. So we were already understanding, but did not recognize it. And this is to say, and now this is trying to deepen the thought here, because the model of understanding, of course, is a scientific model of understanding the world. I count Plato as scientist. Right? That is, you're always looking behind the appearances to something else that is the essence, and looking at them as doing what's the explanation. And in this sense, very important here, we're construing science as the continuation, the necessary continuation of our ordinary perceptual activities. So it's not as if there's an independent world of everydayness and ordinary life, and then scientists go into their laboratories and do weird stuff. If the transition between perception and understanding is right, necessarily, in operating with our ordinary logic of things, let's call it our thoughtless logic of perception of objects, we have already committed ourselves to a scientific two-tier account of things. And therefore, it is not surprising, this is right, that really early in Western civilization, even before Plato, we had explainers, right? Gods and the idea that there were a reality behind the appearances bringing them about. So the problem is still the problem of one and many. Hence, the dialectic here will be various moments that will, in a certain sense, recapitulate the dialectic of perception. And hence, I haven't done all of them, but I was wanting to show how the perceptual model of one and many, right, maps right on to a further, more complicated model of one and many, of the kind that Hegel operates. So these are some of the variations on this structure. This is why the chapter is agony, that Hegel is operating with. And of course, behind that operation, Adam was right to say that all along there is a kind of Kantian idea of appearances and things in themselves. So consciousness to this point has been active, but does not yet recognize or acknowledge its own activity. So force and understanding will bring, that is the meaning of the dialectic here, is to bring consciousness to a recognition of its active role in the constitution of the structure of its comprehension of the world. And that all the fundamental differences that it tries to attribute to the world turn out to be internal to it. That is its way of thinking about the world, and not somehow the world in itself, independently of being thought about, that is at work here. And when we discover that, then it will turn out that consciousness is not limited, since the thing now is not an obstruction. I can guess at what it's really doing. Now, whatever it's doing is doing whatever it is in virtue of the ways in which I find that I must think about it. So the things are no longer a limit to my understanding of them, but rather internal to that understanding, and hence, again, the relation between subject-object dualism breaks down. That finally, essence is going to migrate into consciousness. Okay. Well, remember Hegel's claim that science appears. Keep that thought in mind throughout this section, because Hegel's view is, if I may use a contending phrase, there can be nothing hidden. Whatever is essential must appear, and hence there's nothing, if that's true, there's nothing hidden, then it follows that there's nothing behind or beyond the world of appearances. We might want to construe the world of appearances in very complicated ways, as structured in certain ways, but it's not as if there's anything other than how things appear. In the preface, which I haven't let you read, Hegel discusses the issue under the heading of, well, I guess, let's call it, the question is, what's the big deal with appearances? And he raises the question in paragraph 38, I'm sorry. And he says there, now, because the system of the experience of spirit embraces only the appearance of spirit, the advance from this system to the science of the truth in its true shape seems to be merely negative, and one might wish to be spared the negative as something false, and demand to be led to the truth without more ado. Why bother with the false? With appearances. The view already discussed, namely that we should begin the science straight away, is to be answered at this point by examining the nature of the negative in general, regarded as what is false. And he answers this question about true and false after discussing it for a bit in paragraph 47. Famous paragraph. And here he says, philosophy, on the other hand, has to do not with the unessential determination, but with determination insofar as it is essential. Its element and content is not the abstract or non-actual, but the actual, that which posits itself and is alive within itself, existent within its own notion. All perfectly obscure. It is the process which begets and traverses its own moments. Oh, sorry, Roxy. What's the German? Roxy's worried about the word moment. She's our German in this class. Okay, I'll carry on reading while you're going. Moment? Okay, just it is, yeah. Traverses its own moments, and this whole movement constitutes what is positive in it and its truth. This truth, therefore, includes the negative also. What would be called the false, it could be regarded as something from which one might abstract. The evanescence itself must, on the contrary, be regarded as essential. Evanescence must be regarded as essential. Not as something fixed, cut off from the true, and left lying who knows where outside it, any more than the true is regarded as something on the other side, positive and dead. So this can't be just thrown away, and this simply some behind that you can't get in touch with. Appearance. All this just with a sentence. Appearance is the arising and passing away that does not itself arise and pass away, but is in itself and constitutes the actuality and the movement of the life of truth. In the chapter we're reading, that distinction is appearance and appearance as appearance. So, appearance is the arising and passing away. So there's no behind appearance. What is essence is this process of arising and passing away that itself does not arise and pass away, And that process constitutes the actuality and the movement of the life of truth. And hence the famous incomprehensible sentence, "The true is thus the bacchanalian revel, in which no member is not drunk, yet because each member collapses as soon as he drops out, the revel is just as much transparent and simple repose." Okay. So, he's sure that's right. but, right? So the thought behind this chapter, and I'm just trying to motivate you to see that what the difficulty he's trying to get past is our great temptation is to think, and here, whether it's Descartes or Plato or Galileo or Aristotle or Leibniz, it doesn't matter. Every philosopher wanted not merely the appearances, but something lying behind them that was the true thing, and that somehow was independent of them, not contaminated by them, was truly in itself. But he says that would be dead, right, if it was that. So whatever is on the left-hand side here must be something much more like a way of thinking about what's on the right-hand side, and not two separate realms. So what's going to happen now in this chapter, right? You can see my strategy. There's not to talk about the chapter, talk about what's in it. Is that understanding is going to want to find ways of relating them that keep them separate, right? That keep something as truly essence that will be independent of those appearances, and it's going to, and this is why perception helps us here, it's going to continually run into the exact same problem that Professor Zaretsky nicely helped us see before. Namely, every time we think we have an inner that is the essence behind a manifold outer, we're going to ask, what's the content of that inner? And the inner is going to be given by the determinacy of these appearances. That is, whatever the inner is, it would be empty, indeterminate nothing without those appearances in their determinacy and their complexity. And therefore, the search for something that would really explain them, right? Where the notion of really explain means be independent of them, uncontaminated by them. Right? And Hegel says if you do that, right, you end up with something positive and dead. That's the whole way in which every single moment of this chapter works. So this chapter really does logically recapitulate the structure of perception. So there's an irony behind the simplicity of perception and the incomprehensibility of this chapter, in that they actually both have the same thing going. Okay. Next problem. Even a cursory reading of this chapter, I don't know if it's not, we have to spend months to get beyond a cursory reading, says that it lacks a phenomenological feel. It feels less phenomenological than almost any chapter in the book. And it feels like another kind of form of argumentation is going on. And the question is why? I mean, it is phenomenological, but it feels different. Well, why? Because a two-tier model of the object is at one level, namely scientifically or metaphysically, true. Hegel is not denying that some story about gravitation, some story about attractive and repulsive forces, some story about negative and positive charges in electricity, he's not denying that scientific story is going to be... Now, he has his own wild philosophy of nature. That's another problem. But some version of this is perfectly okay. Hence, Hegel is not disputing, at least here, the general validity of Newtonian physics or the theory of magnetism or of electricity, although it can seem that way. So if he's not contesting the content, what is he doing? What he's contesting is not its scientific or even metaphysical content. He's contesting the philosophical understanding of that metaphysical content. So what's at issue here is not a philosophy of science, but rather a taking of a scientific view of the world and making it into a philosophical or metaphysical story about the world. So what he's contesting is a form of what we nowadays call scientism or reductive naturalism, and we'll see this later in the book in different ways, other versions of scientific reductionism that he'll contest in the chapter on reason. And therefore, what he's doing is saying you cannot take, as Locke did, I want to be an underlaborer to Newton. So, Big Wellesley mentioned that list. And simply say, I clear away the underbrush so that story about how the world looks from the point of view of science is the whole story. That's what he's contesting. That you can translate that scientific understanding into how the world is. So we may say that the one thing that science does not understands the world just fine. It doesn't understand itself. So it's a scientific misunderstanding of the meaning of scientific activity that is at stake in this chapter. And hence, what's going to happen is that at every moment when understanding should, as it were, be moving to a philosophical self-understanding, an activity of self-reflection, it does something else. It concocts another screwy metaphysical scientific model. It just wants this structure to work and does not want to ask what it's doing in thinking about the world in accordance with this structure. So again, it's a refusal to acknowledge its own activity. So what the chapter will do is to make explicit through the phenomenological movement. There is a phenomenological movement, but the phenomenological movement is going to be a continual movement by where understanding is forced to see that itself is the issue and not the object.
Understanding or perception?
Understanding. Right? So understanding is the one who does these various ways of trying to concoct this. Okay, let's look at the text a little bit. are we? Is the structure I'm now trying to lay out beginning to? No. Okay. Well, we'll just see how it goes. But do ask questions. It's not now. When is the same goes. Paragraph 134, let's begin there. So we're operating with a genuinely two-tiered model in which being for self is being for another. And he says, that only in this way can an object have a self-identical essence. Right? So something can be self-identical, which is again what perception wanted, what sense certainty wanted, only if it has this double movement. It is in itself by being for another. And then his first modeling of that occurs in paragraph 136. One moment then appears as the essence that has stepped to one side as universal medium or as the subsistence of independent matters. So one of the things that, and in fact all the best scholars have problems here, we don't know where he's getting this stuff from. Some of it's from Schelling, some of it's from Kant's Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science, maybe from Boscovich, I'm not sure, but there's probably other sorts of screwy philosophies of nature as well as sciences of his own time going on. And the difficulty is he's doing here what he always does, namely he takes things out of context and he schematizes them in order to present a general philosophical position. So you just have to kind of patiently wait and let the structure of what he's talking about come through. So don't get thrown by the technical vocabulary. Almost never is the technical vocabulary important. It really always comes down to conceptual structures. But the independence of these matters is nothing else than this medium. In other words, the unconditioned universal is simply and solely the plurality of diverse universals of this kind. So the unconditioned universal is nothing but its plurality of diverse universals. That within itself, universal is undivided unity. With this plurality means, however, that these matters are each where the other is. They mutually interpenetrate, but without coming into contact with one another, because conversely, the many diverse matters are equally independent. Skip down 2 sentences. In other words, the matters posited as independent directly pass over into their unity, and their unity directly unfold the diversity, and this once again reduces itself to unity. But this movement is called force. One of its moments, the dispersal of the independent matters in their immediate being, is the expression of force, but force taken as that which they, in which they disappeared, is force proper. So it just so happens I can diagram this. So we're beginning with a many one structure. And our problem, so this is where we left things in the world of perception, and our problem is how to connect them. And we're now going to say that they're going to be connected via force, and that force is going to have two aspects to it. Force proper, and the expression of force. What does this diagram tell us? I take it as an accurate, if you read the passage, look at the diagram, I think that's about right. What does the diagram tell us? Or not tell us? Do you feel satisfied the way you did before? Yeah, John?
That the many and the one are just different things. I mean, so expression is often proper, it's different.
Absolutely. That we actually haven't gotten very far. That we've done some mediations. We've got something going down here, but all we've done is complicate the original story, right? By saying it's the nature of the one to express the many, but we still want to know, right? Why does it, now it just is, so now you have proper expression. And you're repeating the same structure over again. So the issue here is that very top of the next page, Hegel says, when we, now that's us observers, preserve the two moments in their immediate unity, the understanding to which the notion of force belongs is, strictly speaking, the notion which sustains the different moments, qua different in themselves. They are supposed to be different. In other words, what's doing the work here, if anything's doing the work here, is a way of thinking about what the notion of force means, the notion, and not some metaphysical posit. But the understanding wants to construe this notion realistically as a being apart from thought, so that each mode here is going to be the attempt to keep the internal difference, the thought difference between one and many, force proper, force in its expression, to keep that internal difference external. A real external relation. So, what understanding wants is a structure in which X explains Y, where the crux for it is the nature of the relata. Everything in this chapter can be shifted into a matter of intonation. What Hegel wants to say is X explains Y. And he's going to shift all the thinking about what's important into how we think about how they're connected, not into the structure of the items connected. Hegel's language, then, throughout the chapter is neutral with respect to particular metaphysical theories, since he's here making a phenomenological point about an epistemic temptation, namely the epistemic temptation to explain the manifold of appearances through the unity of what does not itself appear and what is configured as a metaphysically or ontologically independent realm. So it's important that this be the invisible. And once you realize that this is the invisible, or force proper, as the invisible, explaining the visible, or the intelligible, explaining the sensible, then you begin to think that we can put a lot of different things in this place. You can do as he is doing here, go below, and think that we put forces, or atoms, or primary qualities underneath. Or you can do it above and say it's Platonic universals, or laws, or anything else you want to say that is separate from and independent from the appearances. Okay, paragraphs. So, for example, paragraphs 137 to 141 are the attempt to show that the postulation of force, as and what force is doing here, it's forming the glue holding the many together, must contain a logical complexity. And it turns out that that logical complexity must eventually work its way back into the notion of force itself. That is, one force cannot do all the work that the notion of force must do if it is to succeed in explaining how there are things or objects at all. So, I suppose, or I am supposing, that, if I can find it quickly, that he's thinking about something like Proposition 6 in Kant's Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science. I take it none of you have read this book. So when I say that, I know you have no idea what Kant is going to do here, and I'm just going to read it briefly since it's fascinating by itself, is try to show, and by the way, these crazy Germans, this became a massive source of argument in German philosophy after Kant. This is an attempt to show a priori that there must be at least two forces. That you cannot have a world with just one force. And the Proposition 6 reads, by mere attraction, maybe gravity, by mere attraction, without repulsion, no matter is possible. That's the thesis. And Kant says, I won't read the whole thing, but it's actually quite simple. He says, attractive force is that moving force of matter whereby it compels another to approach it. That's right. Compels another to approach it. Consequently, when such force is found among all parts of matter, then it endeavors by means of this force to diminish the distance of its parts from one another, and hence the space they together occupy. Can anyone see what the problem is going to be here? Imagine a world with just one force in which everything tries, right? You just, that everything's going to collapse into an instant. And that's exactly what Kant is going to argue. Now, nothing can hinder the action of a moving force except another moving force opposed to it. The force that is opposed to attraction is repulsive force. Therefore, by mere approach and without repulsive forces, all parts of matter would approach one another without hindrance and diminish the space that matter occupies. And there it goes, right? And therefore, there'd be no space, and matter would just be a black hole. So there must be at least two forces for matter to be possible. Hegel's analysis here simply underlines Kant's conclusion, namely, these two, whether they're attractive or doesn't matter, both belong inseparably to the concept of matter. Therefore, there must be a minimum of two forces. And therefore, we have now an a priori account of the constitution of matter. So, paragraph 141, the essence rather consists simply and solely in this, that each is solely through the other. What each thus is immediately no longer is, since it is the other. They have thus, in fact, no substances of their own which might support and maintain them, etc., etc. Now, the point that Hegel wants to make here is that force remains only through the thought of it. Now, Kant is attempting, in fact, such an a priori constitution. Hegel's point is that the metaphysical oomph, which is supposed to allow force to be the kind of ontological glue, the cement of the universe, is nothing but a reflective construction. Exactly the kind of construction you just read. That's why I read the passage. That is, what I want to say is that what the understanding is doing is in fact doing something like Kant's a priori construction of matter, in which what's happening? In which the intelligibility of the world is being gotten by showing that there must be more than so on and so forth. But then saying, no, this is not a priori, is projecting it back out into saying, this is the way the world is. Now, I can see the puzzle on your face. What am I not making clear here? The suggestion I want is that our willingness to consider that the world is composed of attractive and repulsive forces does not get its power, its what I'm calling metaphysical oomph, from the notion of force itself, but from the thought process of the a priori construction, whereby we are able to conceive of a world in terms of two forces in a way we cannot conceive of a world in terms of one force. So the difference between the two here is the difference between thinking of this situation metaphysically and thinking of it constructively. Understanding wants all the insight allowed by a priori construction, while repudiating that it gets its insight that way. It wants it to come from the matter itself. Somebody asked a question. I can see the puzzlement. Failing somehow. Yeah.
Maybe just to switch the terminology.
Yeah.
Is the many the explanandums and the one the explanandum?
Yep.
Or vice versa? Okay.
But that's going to be the problem. That's wonderful. So part of the issue is that there's an explanand and an explanandum. And what Hegel's going to continually do is show that the explanans cannot be what it thinks it is without the explanandum.
So something akin to initial realism, whose explanatory force is what is uninterrogated at a lower level?
No, it's the question concerns the role of the understanding itself in the construction of these relationships. Let me try we can come back to the more other stuff next week and fill out the story. Let me try going to the end of the story and see if that will help. Because I can see that the puzzle is deep. Paragraph 163. We'll just do this in the quick. Relax a bit. And see if this will get us where we need to be thinking about. We can work backwards from here. So, infinity, and we knew we were going to get there, right? Infinity, or this absolute unrest of pure self-movement, that's the bit I already read you about the Bacchanalian Rebel, in which whatever is determined one way or another as being is rather the opposite of this determinateness. This, no doubt, has been from the start the soul of all that has gone before, but it is the inner world that it has first freely and clearly shown itself. And now this is the bit I wanted to talk about. Appearance, or the play of forces, already displays it, but it is as explanation that it first freely stands forth, and in being finally an object for consciousness, as that which it is, consciousness is thus self-consciousness. the understanding, one explains many. Okay? Let's just think about that for a moment. One explains many. It supersedes the differences present in the law, differences which have already become pure differences but are still indifferent and posit them in single unity and force. Move down, but this movement, or necessity, is thus still a necessity and a movement of the understanding, or the movement as such is not the understanding's object. On the contrary, in this movement, the understanding has objects, positive and negative electricity, distance, force or attraction, and 1,000 other things which constitute the content of the moment of the movement. The reason why explaining affords so much self-satisfaction is just because in it consciousness is, so to speak, communing directly with itself. And then a slightly embarrassing phrase, enjoying only itself, although it seems to be busy with something else, it is in fact occupied only with itself. Overcoming. Why is this the conclusion? Because the search here of the one and the many is to find a structure that will answer the question, why? That's what we're doing. We're trying to get a structure that will answer our why, but to say that that's why what we're doing, why the many, how do we explain the many, and therefore what we're looking for is a good explanation. That's what we're really looking for. But things don't explain things. I mean, that's simply mixing up two vocabularies. Explaining, and there are two ways of explaining, let's assume for a moment, deduction and induction. Okay, we can explain what there is by deducing it, or explain by providing an induction that will get us to the law. Right? Those are human activities of comprehension. So when we finally try to understand what's going to work here, what we're asking for is what is going to count as a good explanation. Not what is the structure of the universe, but what is going to count as a good explanation of the universe. And in order to do that, we have to think about the nature of scientific inquiry. Not the nature of the world, but the nature of scientific inquiry. Why we would prefer one kind of theory over another kind of theory. And once we realize that that's what we're going to be doing, that is, we're not going to be understanding the world, but understanding scientific theory construction, then our object, the truth of science, is not science, but the meaning of science. The truth of science, the reason science matters, the reason we care about science, is not merely because of its content, but because it allows us understanding of the world. But understanding of the world is a matter of our finding good explanations that have models to them, that have a certain bunch of criteria. Well, who sets up this criteria? Who determines what is going to count as good science? And the answer Hegel's going to give is, we do. We, as a community, in dialogue with one another, work out the terms for an adequate theory of science. And we operate with criticisms, right? So I don't know if you keep up with this. I'm gripped by the fact that 2 books have just come out saying that string theory isn't it. And it's fascinating because string theory has been the theory of physics for the last 20 years, and the mathematics of it is astounding, and it turns out it's empty. It's just good mathematics. It's great mathematics. But so far, it's made no difference in the physical understanding of anything. Right? This is the problem, right? It's perfectly empty. Now, who says that? We say that. So there's no, ultimate theory. Is it? Rather, will it fill the role of doing a job? And the answer is, will it provide a good explanation? So when we're doing science, this is Hegel's kicker, if you wish. This is the embarrassing phrase. We are communing with our own models of understanding. So of course we say, I suspect that theory is true because it's simple and elegant and powerful. But wait, simple, elegant? What does that have to do with force and expression? It doesn't. But it does. We can't talk about force and expression without talking about theories that are simple and powerful and deductively rich. Now, why is that important? Because the standpoint of consciousness, which is what this section was about, claimed that the truth of human beings in the world was their representations of the world, that their being in the world via their representations, and that the theory of force and understanding was to be the most robust version of that representational self-understanding of human beings. So the meaning of this is that we are not related to the world via our representations of it, because science is not fundamentally a representational activity. Science fundamentally is an explanatory activity, an activity of achieving good or adequate. So what Hegel is trying to do in these passages that I've been looking at is trying to show that the understanding is trying to get in the world, by the way it talks about essence and appearance, a connection between them that can't be had between things, between objects. That the connection that would make it work is not about the world. It's about an adequate comprehension of the world. That is about explanation. So it puts its interest in the wrong place. Even more puzzling. Okay, let us stop there. What we will do next week is begin with Force and Understanding. I'll go through some more passages. We'll try to think about this movement, because what I'm trying to do here is to get at the critical turn, and we will begin. We'll make the transition to self-consciousness. We'll do the master slave, but we'll do the transition.